Okay, so good morning everyone. Welcome to Hong Kong Student University once again. Today is the last day of our 3-day short course. Yesterday we have been discussing a few interventions on expressive writing and affect labeling. So today we will continue to look into other evidence-based practice. So I welcome you all again, and let's clap our hands to show a warm welcome to Dr. Keely. Dr. Keely, please.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who are returning, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. I see a lot of familiar faces by now, so that's really nice. So yeah, it's hard to believe we've come to the last session of this short course. So today, I think actually as I thought about the title here, it's a bit of a misnomer because we're still going to talk about the brain and we're still going to talk about neuroscience. But what I really wanted to spend some time discussing today is the ways in which we're learning about how the body and how our physiological states contribute to our social and our emotional functioning. And I think in Chinese culture, maybe you all have had greater appreciation for this connection between the mind and the body, more so than we have in Western culture and in the US. But now I think there's lots and lots of very compelling research suggesting not only can the processes that happen in our brains and our social and emotional lives influencing what's happening internally in our bodies, but also changes in our bodily states that might be due to things outside of our psychological experiences can also communicate back to the brain and influence the way that the brain is working, influence our emotions, and influence the way that we experience our social environments. So I'm really excited to kind of talk more about the ways in which not only the mind and the brain affect the body, but the ways in which the body can affect the brain. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. Okay, so for today's discussion, we'll start with kind of this big philosophical question that I'm not going to provide a very compelling answer for, but I'll at least give you a little bit of insight into research that's been trying to understand for our mental and physical health, is it better to pursue experiences that cause us to feel good, or to pursue experiences that cause us to do good? So we'll talk a little bit about the neural and genetic pathways that link different types of well-being to improved health. And then in the second part, I really want to switch gears to emphasizing this role that the body and that bodily states and physiological activation play in influencing the brain and informing the brain about how to respond to the environment. So I'll talk about some really exciting research that's been looking at how reappraising or changing the way that we think about our physiological arousal might actually improve performance. So thinking about how the ways in which we interpret our bodily cues can either help us or hurt us in terms of our functioning. And then I'll sort of circle back to talking about a bit more of my own work, where I've been looking at how alterations in the functioning of the immune system and activation of the immune system can feed back to the brain to influence our social and emotional experiences. And then I'm really hoping that there'll be plenty of time at the end for question and answer and discussion about the topics I'm going to discuss today, but also about all three of the seminars over the last few days, and sort of anything that, as you've had time to think and reflect upon the things that we've been talking about, that has cropped up. Okay, so to start with, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about different types of well-being and how different types of well-being might be influencing or represented in the brain and how they might influence the body. And I'm going to focus on these two different types of well-being called hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. Okay, so this is a concept that goes way back to Greek philosophy and to Aristotle. And they're sort of seen as these two different types of ways that we can pursue happiness. So one way is basically to pursue pleasure, things that are very rewarding and just sort of make us feel good. This is called hedonic well-being. So this is sort of the sum or the average of our positive affective experiences. So, think about something that you really like to do that just brings you a lot of pleasure, like enjoying maybe a really good meal. Or going shopping and buying something new that you really love. So something that's very pleasurable and brings just a lot of pleasure into your life. So this is what we call hedonic well-being. On sort of the opposite end of the well-being spectrum, we have eudaimonic well-being. And this is the idea that we might, instead of pursuing things that are purely pleasurable, that sort of purely bring about this sense of pleasure, we might pursue positive experiences that provide us with a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. So this is more well-being that rather than tapping into kind of basic pleasure, that taps into our sense of fulfillment, that gives our lives meaning and purpose. So, this might be something like, going back to the couch potato from yesterday, maybe something like running a marathon, right? Something that it's hard and it's sometimes painful. It's a lot of training and a lot of a lot of time that we have to give up to devote to doing this, training plan to run this super long distance. But it provides positivity and contributes to well-being insofar that it gives our life sort of meaning and purpose and gives us a sense of fulfillment. So clearly, both of these types of well-being could be important and both could contribute to our physical and mental health. And a lot of research over the past few years has been focusing on basically which of these should we pursue. If we want to live the healthiest, happiest lives that we can, should we be pursuing experiences that bring us pleasure, or experiences that bring us this sort of higher order meaning and purpose and fulfillment? And what are the mechanisms? What's happening in the brain and in the body during these different types of positive experiences that might link them to happiness and well-being and physical health? So to give you a little bit more insight into what I mean by hedonic and eudaimonic well-being, on page 8 in your course materials handout, there's a questionnaire that's a survey that we often use to assess hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. So if you want to pull those out quickly and complete it, it's asking you to indicate the extent to which you've had these different feelings in the past month. So take a quick look at that. I think it gives you some insight into what we mean by hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. I'll give you a second to look at that. Okay, so people had a chance to check out the questions and sort of see. Okay, so let's go through each of the items and talk about what type of well-being they might be measuring. So during the past month, how often did you feel happy? So that would be an item that's assessing hedonic well-being. So the first one here, sort of how often have you felt pleasure, positivity? The second question, how often in the past month did you feel that you had experiences that challenge you to grow and become a better person? That's much more eudaimonic well-being, right? Positive experiences that provide meaning and purpose and fulfillment. Third one, how often have you felt satisfied with life? More hedonic. That your life has a sense of direction or meaning. Again, it's right there in the question, more eudaimonic. How often have you felt interested in life, more hedonic? And then that you had something to contribute to society, more eudaimonic. Yeah, exactly. So I think one thing that probably jumps out to you, or certainly jumps out to me as I look at these, is that they're not totally separable. Right? It's not as though you can't be high on eudaimonic well-being and feel like you have purpose and meaning and direction and that you're contributing to society and not be happy and not experience pleasure. That's not the case at all. In fact, often these two measures of well-being are really highly connected and highly correlated. So individuals who, tend to be high on one type of well-being also tend to be high on the other. So it's not as though people who pursue hedonic experiences necessarily are only out for their own good and their own pleasure and aren't feeling like they're contributing anything meaningful to society. And on the other hand, it's not as though people who are pursuing activities that really give them a sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment are not experiencing happiness or pleasure. Certainly, those things go together. But you can look at them at least somewhat separately, or look at variability in people who might be higher on one type than the other, and see how it relates to health and well-being. And lots of research is now accumulating in adults, and actually even some in adolescents and in younger populations, showing that it's really eudaimonic well-being, this sense of having meaning and purpose and fulfillment. That's protective of health. That even in difficult, stressful life circumstances, if individuals are pursuing positive experiences that give them a sense of meaning and fulfillment, they experience some buffering. Their health is sort of protected. And more recently, researchers have started to ask sort of why. Why is this happening? What are the mechanisms in the brain and in the body that might be linking these eudaimonic well-being experiences to better physical and mental health? So sort of how is this happening? And one of the questions that my colleague at UNC, Eva Telzer, was interested in asking is, does differential activation of reward-related pathways in the brain, so similar to the neural systems that we talked about yesterday when we were talking about winning money and eating good food and giving support to others, so are those reward pathways during eudaimonic and hedonic experiences related to depression? So might we be able to get some insight into individuals' risk for or resilience to depression based on understanding their neural responses to these different types of positive experiences that vary in whether they're more hedonic or purely pleasure-based compared to if they're more eudaimonic. So to answer this question, Dr. Telzer brought 37 adolescents into the laboratory, and she scanned them using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI again, at time 1, when they were all about 16 years of age. And they, while they were in the MRI scanner, they were completing a hedonic and eudaimonic reward task. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But they were completing this task that gave a measure of the way in which their reward system responded to both hedonic and eudaimonic experiences or decisions. And then she also measured their levels of depression. So how high was their depressive symptomatology? Then 1 year later, when they're now all about 17 years old, she had them complete the same measure of depressive symptoms again. So she's able to look at not just how depression at one time point is associated with their neural responses to these different experiences, right? But how neural responses at time 1 are related to change in depression over time. And this is really critical because a lot of what we're trying to do now with these neuroimaging or neuroscience techniques is to not just look at sort of how does the brain do X process, but how does the way in which the brain does X process predict an individual's functioning at a later time point. So can we use knowledge of how the brain is responding in one instance to predict, using the brain to predict behavior, psychology, well-being at a later time point? So that's what this design essentially allowed her to do, right? It allowed her to look at how is the brain responding at this time, and does that relate to change in depressive symptoms over time? Okay, so here's the fMRI task that she had her adolescents do in the scanner. So they completed 2 different types of trials. So this is a task that allows them to earn money for themselves and also to earn money for their families at a cost to themselves. Okay, so in the pure reward condition, this is a hedonic decision, they would see something like this, where it says on the left, it's the money they're going to get for themselves. On the right is the money that they would get for their family. So in a hedonic trial, a reward trial, they'd be getting, let's say, $3, this is American dollars, for themselves, and no change in money for their family. So this is sort of analogous to just the pure pleasure pathway, right? The pure reward. It's the hedonic. I'm getting money that could allow me to buy something that I want, and there's no change in money for my family. So they get to decide basically if they want to accept this choice or not. Unsurprisingly, most people say, yeah, I'll take that $3. There's no consequence to my family, right? It's more money in my pocket. The other types of trials that she had were these costly donation trials. And this is trying to tap into a little bit more eudaimonic decision making. So in costly donation trials, what would happen is the participant's family would gain money. So in this case, the family earns $5 at a personal cost to them. So they actually would be losing $2 if they decide to accept this offer, right? So it's eudaimonic in that the adolescent would have to sort of sacrifice the personal gain that they would get. They're giving up $2 that they would otherwise have in their pocket to go, buy whatever adolescents buy these days. And in doing so, they get more money for the family. Eva Telzer has used this task in a number of different studies. In interestingly, there are some cultural differences in the way that adolescents' brains respond to this task. So a lot of what she's studied is decision-making in this task in Latino cultures in the U.S. So in samples of Mexican Americans compared to white Caucasian Americans. And Latino cultures tend to be more interdependent and more communal, and also have this strong sense of sort of family obligation. That part of being a good kid or being a good human being is contributing to the family. And in some of her prior work, she's shown that Latino adolescents actually show greater reward-related activity in the brain. So greater activity in the ventral striatum, this key reward structure, in response to gaining money for the family, even at a cost to themselves. Whereas the non-Latino kids, white kids in the US, tend to show more reward activity to the hedonic, sort of gaining money for the self. I don't know if any work has tried to use this task in Chinese culture, but I think that would be a super interesting project to do and to try to understand sort of if a similar process is at play. So she wasn't looking at, question? Yeah.
Do you think it's the difference?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, certainly. I mean, I think, but one of the things that I think is interesting about her findings, and this is where the neuroscience I think is really critical, is you can imagine that maybe people in more collectivistic or interdependent cultures would say, yes, I'll go through with this, right? I'll lose money for myself and gain money for my family, but I don't necessarily like it. Right? Like, I'll do it. It's part of my obligation. It's part of my cultural norms of what I should do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they find like pleasure or reward in it. But what the neuroimaging suggests is that actually reward pathways are activated when people, at least in Latino cultures, make this type of decision. So it's not just following the cultural script of this is what I should do. It's also, you know, that the brain sort of responds in a way that's consistent with the fact that they might be experiencing more reward or more positivity. So I think it's really interesting and a nice question to answer with neuroscience. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The genetic and all of the combination of that.
Exactly.
I think.
Yeah.
A range of more closely related.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, I mean, externally, come on, but
yeah.
here is
right. Yep. Exactly. Well, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about some of this work is that there's certainly variability. So different people respond in different ways. It's not as though every single person from a Latino background is going to show the same amount of reward-related activity to this type of experience, right? So looking at individual differences or the extent to which people show reward-related activity in response to these costly donations to the family might be related to their, you know, sense of obligation to the family, or the sense of fulfillment that they get from contributing to the family is really interesting, because there certainly will be people who don't show that in response, you know, to this type of experience, and you know, for those individuals, maybe the cultural fit is not as good, and you know, having to serve in this role of contributing a lot to the family could be, you know, more distressing as opposed to rewarding. So lots of variability and lots of interesting open questions in this area of research. So in this study, though, she wasn't looking at cultural differences. It was just looking at basically a measure, an index for each individual of how much did they activate reward pathways in the brain in response to these two different types of decisions. So how much did they activate the ventral striatum, this key reward brain structure, in response to pure reward trials when they were earning money for themselves, compared to costly donation trials where they were earning money for their family at their own expense. And which of those predicted changes in depression over time? So again, we're trying to use the brain response at one time point to predict change in psychological functioning over time. Okay, so here's what she found. So this is the difference score of how much each adolescent's brain responded to the hedonic decisions when they were earning money for themselves compared to the eudaimonic decisions when they were earning money for their family. So values that are over on this side means they had more reward to the hedonic decision. So more reward in response to earning money for themselves. People who are on this side had more reward related neural activity when they were earning money for their family. And on the y-axis here, we have change in depressive symptoms. So people who are above the line here showed an increase in depression over time. People who are below the line here showed a decrease in depression over time. And what you can see from this line, this negative association, is that individuals who showed more ventral striatum, more reward system activation in the brain in response to earning money for themselves, so in response to these hedonic decisions, showed an increase in depression over time. Whereas those individuals who showed more ventral striatum reward-related activation to earning money for their families showed a decrease in depressive symptoms over time. So here's that same graph just broken down. So now rather than comparing hedonic and eudaimonic decisions, we're comparing each one versus their control condition. And what you see here is, again, that for individuals who showed greater ventral striatum activity, greater reward system activity to the eudaimonic decisions, they showed a decrease in depressive symptoms over time. And individuals who showed greater ventral striatum activity to the hedonic decisions when they're earning money for themselves show an increase in depressive symptoms over time. So I think this is super fascinating and suggests that responses in neural systems that are involved in some of our most basic reward processes that are active in response to taking drugs, consuming alcohol, sex, good food, the extent to which individuals activate those same pathways when they're making these eudaimonic decisions, decisions to donate to the family at the expense of the self, are associated with declines in depressive symptoms over time. And interestingly, activation in reward pathways in response to hedonic decisions, so just purely getting money for the self, are associated with increases in depressive symptoms over time. So though I think conventional wisdom and sort of what feels like, at least to me a little bit, is out there in the culture, suggests that, it's really pursuing pleasure that's going to bring us happiness. It's, having money to go to fancy restaurants and on fancy vacations and to lie on the beach and, sort of experience these, pure pleasurable experience, that's what's going to bring us happiness and well-being. Really, the research is showing that pursuing experiences that bring meaning and fulfillment are actually more strongly related to health and well-being over time. And then it could be through these reward mechanisms in the brain that the extent to which people get reward and pleasure from pursuing experiences that provide meaning and pleasure that could be really buffering. So interesting, I think, and maybe leads us to think a little bit differently about the types of experiences that we might pursue. So I would argue that, what this suggests, at least somewhat to me, is that we really need to cultivate in ourselves and provide opportunities for eudaimonic experiences, pursuing activities that bring us meaning and fulfillment. And again, that's not to say that those things won't also bring us pleasure, because certainly they can. But it's sort of a different perspective than what's going to bring happiness is, eating at fancy restaurants and lying on beaches. I was also thinking, back to a topic that we talked about yesterday, maybe part of the ways in which giving support, providing social support to others, which I showed you some work on yesterday, that this is really important for health and well-being and that it buffers against stress. Maybe part of the reason for that is because these are eudaimonic experiences. Providing support to other people can provide meaning and fulfillment in life, again, to the extent that it's not chronic and on a volunteer basis. So maybe this is one of the ways that we can kind of do both simultaneously. We can give support to others, and that can therefore increase our sense of meaning and fulfillment. So one idea. Okay, so there's some evidence for brain mechanisms, right? That reward pathways in the brain might be one mechanism that links eudaimonic experiences and eudaimonic well-being with lower levels of depression. But what about in the body? So how does eudaimonia manifest at a molecular level? Can these experiences of eudaimonic well-being sort of reach into our bodies to influence which of our genes are turned on or turned off at any given time? So we're switching gears a little bit here. I'm going to talk to you briefly about gene expression. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about this emerging research literature, which is suggesting that our social and emotional experiences can indeed influence which of our genes are turned on and turned off at any given time. So I think generally we experience our bodies as pretty stable, right? They're changing maybe a little bit moment to moment, depending on if we're running up the stairs to catch a train in the subway or we're trying to stay awake in a lecture. But generally we experience them as pretty stable. And I think we're, taught to think of genes as this sort of, it's our genetic potential that we're born with, that just is, right? But really, genes only change our bodies and our experiences to the extent that they're turned on, or to the extent that they're transcribed into proteins. And even though we experience our bodies as relatively stable, our genes are being turned on and turned off all the time, and our cells are regenerating all the time. And our genes and our physiology is listening in on the social environment and to our emotional experiences, and deciding sort of which genes to turn on or upregulate and which genes to turn off or downregulate based on the signals that they're getting from the social environment. So they might get these extracellular signals from the endocrine system. We talked briefly about cortisol yesterday, this sort of stress hormone from the sympathetic nervous system. And these are things that are released in response to social experiences, right? And then those signals get bound to receptors on cells that then can go into the nucleus of the cell and change the expression of genes. which then get translated into messenger RNA and translated into proteins that can go out of the cell and influence the physiological functioning of the body. And what recent work in this super exciting field called human social genomics is suggesting is that social stressors, so things like threats of eviction, of social rejection or disillusion of important social relationships, of exam or performance stress, can influence which of our genes are being overexpressed versus underexpressed. And generally, a set of findings is emerging to suggest that social stressors tend to lead to increased expression of pro-inflammatory genes. So I talked way back on the first day about inflammation and the important role that the inflammatory response, part of the immune system, plays in the body in responding to stress. So part of what stress seems to be doing is causing increased expression of pro-inflammatory genes and decreased expression of antiviral genes. So this means stress is sort of creating this situation at the molecular level where individuals are more prone to inflammatory diseases and sort of less able to deal with or to fight off viral infections because they have these down regulation or decrease expression of antiviral genes. So Steve Cole, who's been the real pioneer of this field, has called this the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, CTRA. Basically this idea that in response to stressors, both in early life and later, individuals show this relatively consistent pattern of greater expression of inflammatory genes and decreased expression of antiviral genes. Okay, I know that's a lot, but just take it as our social experiences influence which of our genes are turned on and turned off in this sort of consistent way, such that genes involved in inflammation are increased in their expression and genes involved in fighting off viruses are decreased in their expression. Okay, so now that we've sort of established that this pattern exists, that social stressors can influence this pattern of CTRA gene expression, researchers have began to ask, okay, well, what factors might promote resilience to this pattern of sort of problematic gene expression? Are there particular social or psychological experiences that might be associated with less of this type of gene expression where there's more inflammatory genes and less antiviral genes being expressed? As you might gather, given that the beginning of my talk I talked about eudaimonia, that's what researchers recently have been focused on. So this is work really led and done brilliantly by Steve Cole, who I mentioned is the kind of founder of this field of human social genomics. And then my colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, Barb Fredrickson, who's really a pioneer in the field of positive psychology. So it's kind of this beautiful coming together of someone studying these basic mechanistic biological pathways in terms of which genes are being turned on and turned off, and then a brilliant social psychologist who's really thought deeply about positive experiences and positive psychology and how they might be associated with health and well-being. So what they did in this study to examine if eudaimonic well-being might be associated with less of this pattern of pro-inflammatory increases and antiviral decreases in gene expression was they brought 84, these are healthy midlife adults, so ages 35 to 64, from North Carolina, and they brought them into the lab, and they had them complete that exact same hedonic and eudaimonic well-being questionnaire that I had you all take a look at. So these, 6 questions assessing the extent to which individuals have felt more hedonic experiences of well-being compared to more eudaimonic experiences of well-being in the past month. And then these individuals also provided a blood sample, which is how you measure gene expression. So they took the blood from these individuals, they isolated out the immune cells, and then they looked at which genes were more turned on compared to more turned off among their immune cells. So again, the finding from past research is that individuals who've experienced more psychological stress would show greater upregulation of gene expression in inflammatory genes and greater downregulation of gene expression for genes involved in antiviral. And they were basically wondering, would they see almost the reverse of that in these individuals who would report high levels of eudaimonic well-being. And indeed, that's what they found. So let me walk you through this graph a little bit because it's a bit complicated. So this is the kind of overall measure of conserved transcriptional response to adversity, CTRA, gene expression. And what you can see is that individuals who scored higher on hedonic well-being, so more of that kind of pleasure in life pursuit, showed sort of a similar pattern that we see to individuals who have experienced stress. So greater pro-inflammatory gene expression, lower antiviral gene expression. Whereas individuals who reported high levels of eudaimonic well-being showed the reverse. So rather than showing upregulations of expression of genes involved in inflammation and downregulations of genes involved in antiviral processes, when you look over here, what you see is that the individuals who are high in eudaimonic well-being actually showed greater expression of genes involved in producing antibodies and fighting off viruses and bacteria, and lower pro-inflammatory gene expression, whereas those higher in hedonic well-being showed the reverse of this, right? Greater expression of pro-inflammatory genes, lower expression of antibody genes. So why does this matter? What does this potentially mean for mental and physical health? Well, it's interesting to think about, as I mentioned on Thursday, part of what inflammation does, and I'll talk about this more in a few slides, is potentially contribute to depression. So inflammation in the body can feed back to the brain to influence our depressed mood, our feelings of anhedonia, or sort of a lack of pleasure. And so what this is suggesting is that individuals who are higher in hedonic well-being tend to show greater expression of pro-inflammatory genes that could be sort of putting them at risk for these depressive symptoms, like that was shown in Eva Telzer's study with the adolescents. Whereas individuals who are higher in eudaimonic well-being are showing greater expression of genes involved in producing antibodies, which are effective for fighting off viruses and bacteria. And the idea here is that part of how viruses and bacteria get transmitted is from person to person. And so if you are high in eudaimonic well-being, perhaps a more social person, more connected to other people, you might be more likely to encounter viruses and bacteria because you're more tightly interacting with individuals. And so it would make sense, right? You would want your body to be prepared to potentially fight off those bacteria or those viruses that you come into contact with. Versus on the inflammation end, if you're more isolated, then you might want to activate these inflammatory genes that could help you fight off an injury if you're, attacked or something. If we're thinking about sort of the evolutionary history of this, it could be that in earlier times, being excluded from or ostracized from a group would mean you were at greater risk for being physically harmed. And so it would make sense to activate genes involved in inflammation that would help you heal if you needed it. So that's kind of the idea for why you would see this pattern of differential gene expression. So I want to briefly mention this follow-up study that Steve Cole, one of the authors of this eudaimonia study, did, where they really wanted to ask the question of what's a stronger predictor of people's gene expression? What genes are being turned off or turned on in their bodies? Is it loneliness, sort of this lack of social connection that we've talked a lot about over the past few days, that's a critical predictor of poor health, poor mental health, poor physical health, or eudaimonia? So both of these constructs have been associated with gene expression in previous research. Which one sort of wins out? Which one is a stronger predictor? So interestingly, what you see in the top here is that if you look at them both separately, you see that loneliness is associated with greater CTRA gene expression. So this means greater pro-inflammatory gene expression, less antiviral gene expression. Eudaimonia, similar to what I just showed you in the previous study, was associated with the opposite of that. So greater antiviral genes, lower pro-inflammatory genes. But then what they did is said basically, okay, what if I control for the other? So if I take loneliness and I look at all the variability in people's gene expression that's due to loneliness, but first, I take out all the variability in their gene expression that's due to eudaimonic well-being. So what's left over after I take out all the variability that's due to well-being? So there's no longer a significant relationship. So if I control for people's eudaimonic well-being, loneliness no longer predicts their gene expression. On the other hand, if I take people's gene expression, I remove the variability that's due to their loneliness, and I see what's left over due to their eudaimonic well-being, there's still this strong relationship. So this is some evidence for the idea that perhaps eudaimonic well-being is a stronger predictor of which of our genes are being turned on or turned off than loneliness, which is pretty impactful given all of the work that I've showed you previously about how important social connections are for our health and well-being. So these two studies kind of come together to suggest that eudaimonia is associated with a sort of more adaptive pattern of gene expression compared to hedonic well-being, and that eudaimonic well-being is a stronger predictor of people's gene expression than loneliness. And I think this has really important intervention implications. So on Thursday, I mentioned, social connection, hugely important. We're declaring it a public health issue in the United States. But we don't know how to improve it very well. We don't have a lot of evidence-based interventions for ways to improve people's social connection. It's hard. We don't exactly know very well how to do it. But what I take away, at least partially from data like these, is that maybe what we can do is design eudaimonia interventions instead. Maybe if rather than trying to get people to feel less lonely and more socially connected, we can help them pursue experiences that help them find meaning and fulfillment in life, that can promote health and well-being and sort of counteract any of the negative effects of loneliness and social isolation. I think it's interesting to think about, like I said, with the giving support, that maybe part of what interventions to improve people's eudaimonic well-being might be doing is actually making them feel more socially connected. So you're sort of killing two birds with one stone, so to speak, sort of getting people to feel more fulfilled and more have more meaning and purpose in life, while simultaneously making them feel more socially connected to others. So you're increasing eudaimonic well-being while simultaneously decreasing loneliness or feelings of social isolation. But that's a hunch, and I'm speculating at this point. And I think we need more research and more people to design interventions to get people to experience more eudaimonic well-being, and then we can kind of test these different pathways. There's some interesting research on gratitude and how expressing gratitude or reflecting on gratitude might increase happiness in this more eudaimonic way. So that could be one intervention technique that we could get we could use to maybe increase people's eudaimonic well-being, decrease loneliness and social isolation. But we need lots more work in this area now that we know the importance of these two different factors. So before we take a quick break, are there questions or thoughts or comments on? Yeah.
The loneliness, meaningfulness,
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. 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 And showing how it happens.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have a question. I mean, when
Yeah.
you're talking about gene and when you're talking about also condition,
Mm-hmm.
although we couldn't find the depressed gene,
Mm-hmm.
but they are more sensitively positive things,
Mm-hmm.
meaningful things into
Yeah. Yeah.
and I wonder average people
Mm-hmm.
that we research on.
Right.
Is there any research on people
Depressed.
depressed and look at also we know that when a child is born, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we have a very irritable
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and all of those combined.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether that is also
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head of any work that has tried. I mean, certainly individuals who are depressed show this pattern of greater pro-inflammatory gene expression. I don't know of any work that's tried to intervene at the level of sort of eudaimonic well-being, because I agree with you. I mean, I think for individuals who aren't suffering from any psychopathology, who are sort of relatively psychologically healthy, that these interventions could be effective. But that, things are quite different, obviously, when we're talking about full-blown psychiatric issues or depressive episodes. So I mean, I agree. I wouldn't be willing to say that I think this is going to necessarily work in the same way or be as effective for someone who's struggling with clinical depression. But it seems like, at least for individuals who are healthy but have variability in depressive symptoms, that greater reward system activation during eudaimonic rewards predicts declines in depression over time. But yeah, I agree. I think it could be different in individuals with major depressive disorder, for example. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back for the last part. All right, thank you.